This is Christopher Sernaque hosting episode 21 of season 3 of the Current Topics in Science podcast. This podcast will address breaking scientific news in light of the origins debate and host interviews with scientists. This podcast is available on the following platforms: iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Video recordings of the podcast will be uploaded to YouTube. Enjoy the podcast. Today on Current Topics in Science, we have the honor of hosting Dr. Jerry Bergman. Dr. Bergman has 9 degrees, an associate in biology and behavior science, a bachelor's in sociology, biology, and psychology, a master of science in occupational health, a master of science in public health, a master of science in biomedical science, and a master of arts in social psychology, a master of education in counseling and psychology, and a PhD in human biology, and a PhD in measurement and evaluation with a minor in psychology. Dr. Bergman is and was active in over 22 professional organizations such as the American Psychological Association, the National Association for the Advancement of Science, and the American Association of Suicidology. He's a fellow of the American Scientific Affiliation, is the president and founder of the Society for Male Scientific Study of Male Psychology and Physiology, and he's a member of Mensa, the largest and the oldest high IQ society in the world. Dr. Bergman has over 1,300 publications in 12 languages and has authored over 40 books and monographs. His books and his textbooks that include chapters he authored are in over 1,500 college libraries in 27 countries. His other work experience includes over a decade's worth of experience at various mental health or psychology clinics as a licensed professional clinical counselor. Now, without further ado, good morning, Dr. Bergman. How was your day? How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing fine. It's good to be here.
Well, Dr. Bergman, it's a pleasure to have you on Current Topics in Science again. And since this is Current Topics in Science, let's quickly look at this week's current topic. So, Dr. Bergman, as mentioned in your bio, you have several degrees, some of which are in occupational health, public health, biomedical science, and human biology. So I'd welcome your perspective on this new treatment for waterborne viruses. According to an article from the National Science Foundation, essentially, Texas university researchers are now using electricity to obliterate viruses from the water. The article describes the tractional water purification process by saying, conventional coagulation methods use chemicals to trigger the clumping of particles and microbes in untreated water. These aggregates can then be removed when they settle as sediments. The article then goes on to say that instead of chemical-based coagulation, the researchers investigated whether a coagulation method that uses electricity is as effective at removing microbes from water. They used a surrogate of a non-enveloped virus called MS2 bacteriophage. Their choice of microbes was motivated by the fact that the MS2 bacteriophage shares structural similarities with many non-enveloped viruses that can persist in water after treatment and cause disease in humans. So the researchers themselves, they summarized the paper by saying that virus destabilization and inactivation are critical considerations in providing safe drinking water. We demonstrate that iron electrocoagulation simultaneously removed via sweep flocculation and inactive a non-enveloped virus surrogate, the MS2 bacteriophage, under slightly acidic conditions, resulting in highly effective virus control. So, Dr. Bergman, what do you think of these new methods, and what are some public health rules that you think everyone should keep in mind?
Well, that's a very creative way of dealing with the problem of viruses. Of course, we realize viruses are not alive, and they're called gene machines, and they're made out of DNA, and some are RNA, and these viruses basically are molecules. And once they get into your cells, of course, they can take over your cells and use your cells to produce all kinds of new viruses. And therefore, the solution is very simple. You need to destroy the molecular structure of the virus. And electricity, heat are many ways of doing that. And you want to destroy the virus without destroying other qualities in the water. And so therefore, It just experimentally should be easy to take care of that. It should be easy to deal with determining whether they work or not simply by experimentally evaluating the differences between this method and other methods. And the only concern really is if you produce some molecules in the water, which can be a problem with the energy. And therefore that has to be a concern to make sure you don't produce any toxic elements in the water that could cause a problem.
That's good to keep in mind, Dr. Bergman. With all the trouble that we go through to get rid of viruses, you'd think that these things are just pure evil and that they could serve no good purpose. But apparently that doesn't seem to be the case. According to Dr. Robert Carter, most viruses are beneficial. Dr. Carter writes in his article, Coronaviruses in Creation, "It comes as a shock to many people when they hear it, but most viruses are good for you. Have you heard that there are as many bacteria in and on your body as there are cells in your body?" That is true. But it's also true that you have more viruses in your gut than you have bacteria. In fact, the viral population, called the virome, plays an important role in regulating the number and types of bacteria in your body. Without them, we might be rapidly consumed by hungry little bacteria that live in our intestines. Dr. Carter then goes on to describe a potential area for more research, writing, "In fact, aquatic waterfowl carry all possible types of the influenza virus, including the ones that do not infect humans. From a creation perspective, the influenza virus probably has a beneficial role for the birds, but it's doubtful that anyone's looked into that yet." So, Dr. Bergman, what do you think about this research on beneficial viruses? And are there any other good functions of viruses?
I agree fully with that, and that's well known. I have a presentation where I talk about the importance of viruses, and I say things like, now be sure and thank God in your prayers for viruses. And people think that's kind of a strange thing to say, but on the other hand, it gets their attention. And the fact is, the vast majority of viruses are beneficial. Well, why are some a problem? Well, three reasons. One is mutations. A virus has a mutation, and therefore it causes a problem, even though it normally would not cause a problem. The other is you end up in the wrong host. Viruses that do a good job and work hard in ducks may not do such a good job and work very hard in humans. And therefore, we have a problem of you end up with a transfer from one host, which is no problem, to another host, which is a problem. And therefore, that's another concern. The third thing that is important to keep in mind in viruses is that sometimes you have an interaction in the body which causes a problem. So the virus may not be the problem, the body may not be a problem, but the interaction between particular cells or other organisms in the human body, for example, could create a problem. So these three issues are ones that one has to deal with. Some of the many viruses which perform important roles, and we're not always sure what roles they perform. But one role which you mentioned is, of course, they keep the bacteria in check. Bacterial phages do that, and these bacterial phages basically only attack bacteria. And there are billions of them in your body right now, but they don't cause a problem, so we're not worried about them. But they do keep the bacterial load under control because bacteria can reproduce very fast. There was a story about that which illustrates it quite well, and it's probably covered in just about every college microbiology course. And the story is a man who did something great in the kingdom. And the king said, I am deeply honored to have you in my kingdom and for what you did. How can we repay you? What would you like? Would you like 50 acres of land? Would you like this or that? He said, no, what I would like is very simple. On Monday, give me a plate with 1 grain on it. Tuesday, a plate with 2 grains. Wednesday, a plate with 4 grains. Next day, a plate with double that. And do that for a year. And the king said, well, that's a modest request. Are you sure you don't want anything more? And the man said, no, just a grain first day, 2 the second day, 4 the third day, 8 the fifth day, and so on. And the king said, your wish is granted. Well, what happened is he bankrupted the empire because by the time the year was over, he had zillions of grains of whatever it was that he was asking. And so therefore that illustrates the fact that you start out with 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, and so on. And it's not long, and you end up with enormous numbers. And viruses reproduce in the same way, except they reproduce only so much, and then they don't have the food supply they need, and so therefore they can't reproduce beyond that. But it said, did I say viruses? I meant bacteria. They say that the bacteria reproduce in such a rate where within a day, if they could, if there was the food supply, they would literally take over the earth in a day or so. And it illustrates the fact that viruses have to be there to keep the bacteria load under control, because otherwise they'll cause a problem. So it's a regulation device that is necessary for the balance that we have and we need in our body. So a lot of these things we don't really appreciate, because when we hear about viruses, it's always bad. Oh, you have a virus. Oh, that's a problem. Well, it's a problem with a few viruses, but most viruses, the vast majority, it's not. And we don't really know what the vast majority is because, again, there's not much motivation to study them.
So basically, when you're looking at the amount of bacteria in your body, I know the viruses, their function is kind of turning off the bacteria. So if there's too many of them, so because you do need some bacteria. So the bacteria, they're helping you digest, or helping you distinguish between who is who. Like, is there any other functions that they do as well?
Oh, bacteria is essential for, of course, regulation of many different aspects. And of course, one of the most best examples is they produce certain vitamins. And without those bacteria, you're not going to produce the vitamins. And this is well known now. In fact, when you buy yogurt, for example, it'll tell you good for health is eating yogurt. And of course, yogurt has bacteria in it. In fact, foods that have bacteria in them, like a lot of sour fruits, a lot of different sour vegetables, I guess. Some of that vinegar, I guess, is a good example, is important for good health because it has, among other reasons, it has the bacteria necessary for good health. So, in fact, you can buy root beer belly is one example. It's literally bacteria, and it has root beer flavor. And then you swallow the root beer belly, and then it basically provides the bacteria you need for essential health. And so, yeah, bacteria is a very important part of our health. We need the good bacteria. We just need it to be in the right place at the right time. There's a lot of bacteria that is on your body right now, which is doing an important role. But if that bacteria gets inside of your body, it causes a problem. Like Staphylococcus aureus is a good example. And our body is covered with them, no problem. But if they get inside of the body, they can cause a problem because they're designed to work in one place and not in other places. And that's, by the way, why we bleed. We are designed to bleed so that when we get a cut, the bleeding washes away the Staphylococcus aureus, among other bacteria, and therefore it cleans the area, and the body's designed to bleed for a certain length of time. And if it doesn't bleed, you need to make it bleed, or you need to put something on it to kill the bacteria. But bleeding is good. And then beyond that point, it's not good, and so therefore then it has to stop. So to some degree, it's timed.
That's incredible. And also, it shows you how well designed I think Michael Behe actually spoke. Dr. Michael Behe spoke about the blood clotting system, how it's irreducibly complex.
Oh, yeah, very much so. And if you're missing one factor for humans and most mammals, factor 8, for example, is the most well known. If factor 8 doesn't work, then clotting doesn't work at all. So you need every single part of the clotting system, so it'll clot properly. And again, it has to bleed for a certain amount of time, so you have a timer on there. It has to go through certain stages to heal properly. And the blood clotting cascade is necessary to go through those stages. And factor 8 is most well known because, of course, it causes hemophilia. And therefore, it is a very well known. There's others too. Factor 9, I think, is involved, but I would say 90% are mutation in factor 8, which causes one to be a bleeder. So yes, I taught anatomy at the medical school for many years, and many years total of teaching anatomy. And therefore you learn how really well designed the body is.
Dr. Bergman, that was pretty incredible. So we went over a few different things, intelligent design of the blood, and then you also mentioned different kinds of viruses. You mentioned that last one. That's a good area for research, I think. But so now that we've actually gone over a few of those good functions of the viruses, I think it would be good if we looked at viral behavior overall and define what they are. According to genome.gov, a virus is a small collection of genetic code, either DNA or RNA, surrounded by a protein coat. A virus cannot replicate alone. Viruses must infect cells and use components of the host cell to make copies of themselves. Often, they kill the host cell in the process. So, what's interesting is that not all viruses act the same way, and not all of them can be cured. So, for example, a cold sore, according to Focus Medica, is a common viral infection caused by herpes simplex virus, which results in fluid-filling blisters on or around the lips. And according to the American Academy of Dermatology, once you get the virus that causes cold sores, you have it for life. After the sores clear, the virus travels to your nerves, where it stays unless it reawakens. So, Dr. Bergman, is there anything else that you would like to add to the definition of a virus? And why do certain viruses behave the way they do?
Well, that's a good example because what happens is the virus is dormant. The virus actually leaves its genes inside the cells so that they're a permanent part of the cells. And therefore, the virus is there forever. As long as that cell line is, when it reproduces, it also reproduces the viral DNA that's in there. By the way, the four kinds of viruses, you have single-strand DNA, double-stranded DNA, single-stranded RNA, and double-stranded RNA. And RNA is called a retrovirus, and that has to be converted from RNA to DNA and then back to mRNA, which is how proteins are made from the code, which is in mRNA. And so viruses, the cold sore virus, for example, it seems to be triggered by emotions because it's part of the nervous system, illustrates the fact that the body is enormously complex and it's interrelated with itself. It's also interrelated with the environment. It's also interrelated with the environments around us, including our emotional environment, not just our physical, but our emotional environment, which is influenced by people around us. But anyways, it's kind of neat that they're, in a sense, that they're there forever. You'll have them forever as soon as you get them. And so if you don't have a cold sore when you're, I guess, up to 18 or 20, you'll never have them in your lifetime. But if you have had cold sores in the past, you could have them in the future.
Thank you so much for all those interesting details on virus behavior, Dr. Bergman. And so now that we've looked at the way certain viruses behave, I was wondering about how viruses relate to the world around them. So we know that certain animals will carry viruses like the swine origin influenza virus. It's an influenza virus that circulates in pigs, or mosquitoes carrying the West Nile virus. So how is it that certain animals seem to be carriers of certain viruses? Furthermore, some creatures, like the mosquito, they seem to just be irritants that turn deadly when coupled with a virus. So what role were these creatures and their viruses designed to serve?
Well, mosquitoes is a good example because the problem is not the mosquitoes. The problem is the viruses or the bacteria that ends up in the mosquito. So mosquitoes are just doing their job. And by the way, only female mosquitoes suck blood. And the reason they do that is because they need the elements, the protein and so on, in the blood for their offspring. Male mosquitoes suck nectar from flowers. And so therefore, male mosquitoes are not a problem. The problem is female mosquitoes, but of course they have to get the nutrients they need in order to bear their offspring, and their offspring can be healthy. And therefore, that's a whole different story. By the way, mosquitoes pick up carbon dioxide, which our body gives off, and that's what causes them to be attracted to people. So what role do they serve? Well, they're just part of the creation. And mosquitoes are really fascinating critters if you look into detail how they work and how they live and how they're designed. They're designed very, very well to do their job. And what would that job be in a pre-fall world? I don't know. But a lot of insects cause problems. But my guess is in the pre-fall world, they had a different role. They could have a different role. But now we know with so many insects, they'd serve clearly beneficial roles. Bees, of course, a good example. Spiders, a good example. Spiders tend to eliminate or reduce the amount of problematic insects like flies and so on. And so many insects, in fact, quite a few insects, have a beneficial role that they play. Mosquitoes are kind of infamous because they pick up in their travels. And of course, if they don't have these germs, they're not a problem. But they pick up in their travels certain germs and pass these on to the people they bite. And so they're vectors. They're not themselves the problem. Separate the two. And therefore, if a mosquito doesn't have the vector, it's not a problem. It may be irritating a little bit to have a bump on your arm, but probably in the whole scheme of things, mosquitoes serve a very important role in the entire environment, even though when they bite us, they don't serve a beneficial role. But then bees bite us too. So do many other animals. So because they bite us doesn't mean they're a problem. When you talk about insects, I'm thinking of doing a PowerPoint on insects. When you look at insects carefully, like beetles or box elder bugs, which is a type of beetle, I guess, or bees, or the many kinds of insects there are, you notice they're really incredibly well designed. You just look at the structure of them and the symmetry and the function is just enormously well designed. Fly is a good example. We have no idea how the fly can travel from its own standpoint hundreds of miles per hour forward and then stop almost instantaneously and then reverse and fly somewhere else. If you try to swat a fly with a fly swatter, you know that they're just really incredibly fast. How do they manipulate like this? Are they able to fly so fast in one direction and then reverse course and so fast in another direction? It's amazing. And when you look at the design of flies, you can see that they're really incredibly well designed.
Thank you so much for your answer, Dr. Bergman. And I'm sure you've noticed, as did the audience, that I brought up design and that we've been bringing up design throughout the interview. And so I want to actually focus on that subject. And I already mentioned Professor Michael Behe. He's a leading intelligent design scientist. He's a professor at Lehigh University. He's made the case that viruses are actually evidence of intelligent design, specifically the bacteriophage T4. Professor Behe compared the mechanisms on the bacteriophage T4 to a reciprocating pump and a spacecraft, saying, "It's like an automated syringe. As soon as the legs touch the surface of the cell, it triggers a change in the shape of the lunar lander so that it shrinks and gets narrow part, goes down with a far amount of force, and injects the DNA." So there are hundreds and hundreds of proteins involved in this, and they're all there to do one thing, to inject the DNA into the cell. That's a swell example of irreducibility that wasn't known until a couple of years ago. So Dr. Bergman, in light of Professor Behe's statement, I have two questions. What is irreducible complexity, and what evidence is there that viruses were intelligently designed?
Well, just Behe pointed out, and I should mention relative to Behe's experience, he was an evolutionist and he went through college, got his degree from, I think, Pennsylvania State University in biochemistry and studied biology and so on for much of his life. And when he saw a picture of a bacteriophage, he looked at that and he thought, it must be a designer. How could this thing ever evolve? Because unless it has all its parts, it can't do what it does. It can't spread its genes. And so therefore he realized that there's a problem here with evolution. And he began his research on intelligent design by looking into the bacteriophage. And indeed, it looks like a rocket ship. I had the same impression when I studied microbiology at Wayne State University. I looked at this thing and I thought, this is absolutely incredible how this actually looks very much like a rocket ship. It's geometrically designed. It's designed in such a way to where it looks like it's manufactured in a precision manufacturing company. And so therefore, I realized that this is incredible. I didn't go to the extent that Behe did when he was younger. But on the other hand, I've always been fascinated with the bacteriophage ever since. And as a result, it's obvious design. And evolutionists try to explain this, they can't. Where did it evolve from? How did it evolve? How did it survive? How did it reproduce until it had all the parts? Well, it couldn't. So it's probably one of the best examples of irreducible complexity. Of course, Behe looked at the bacterioflagellum and other things to document his claim for irreducible complexity. But to me, irreducible complexity is obvious, even though he's criticized for it. But if you think about it, everything in the universe requires at least more than one part to function. And I'm not aware of a single quark. If it can function, I guess it might function as a quark, but even an atom, for an atom to function as an atom, it has to have a certain number of parts. And so I guess I should say from an atom on up, it has to have a certain number of parts. Without carbon atoms, the best example, carbon 12. In order to get carbon 12, you must have 6 protons, 6 electrons, and 6 neutrons. The only way you'll ever get carbon 12. If you have one less electron, you have an ion. If you have one more proton, you have an isotope. If you have one less electron, you don't have carbon anymore. If you have one more electron, you don't have carbon. So to be carbon 12, you must have, it's only one different combination that works, and that is 6 protons, 6 electrons, and 6 neutrons. You must have that complete set. And so carbon is irreducibly complex. And you look at everything and you can see it's irreducibly complex. So I'm bothered by those who say, oh, Behe's idea has been refuted. It's been shown to be false. I don't see that. I don't see that at all. Can you get carbon 12 by any other combination? You can't. To me, they're almost irrational when they claim certain things can be produced without the necessary parts. And a lot of examples. Watch is another example. You say, well, you don't need a crystal. Well, that's true. You don't. For a watch to work, it's not going to work as well. But if the watch is designed to work underwater, you need a crystal. You need a crystal for it to work. And so we have to specify what you're talking about when we talk about irreducible complexity. That yes, you can remove certain parts, you can remove the watch band, and it'll work as a watch, but not as a wrist watch. So to get a wrist watch, you have to have some contrivance to get the thing on your wrist. And so therefore I try to specialize and go into some details of some examples.
So I really appreciated all those examples, Dr. Bergman. I never thought about considering a virus as evidence for intelligent design because I thought that they were strictly harmful. And while I was preparing for this interview, I was taking a look at your article called Did God Make Pathogenic Viruses? And that's a really good question because if viruses were made by God, how could a benevolent God create something that would bring about pain and death? In your article, you wrote, most viruses live in their host without causing problems. Pathogenesis is evidence of something gone wrong, a mutation, or the accidental movement of genes, and not evidence of a system deliberately designed to cause human disease and suffering. So, Dr. Bergman, in other words, you believe that viruses were intended goods that broke over time, or after the fall of Adam and Eve. So can you please give us a complete picture? So in other words, from before the fall of humankind to now, what have viruses been like? And can you give some examples of what went wrong with them?
Well, since about 98% are beneficial, I guess they're doing okay. It's the other 2 or 3% that's causing a problem. And what went wrong, I think, primarily was mutations and misuse. We misuse the environment, and therefore misusing the environment, we end up causing problems. We have a lot of chemicals, toxic chemicals, which we release into the environment, and that has affected certain viruses, and the viruses then affect us adversely. Another example is, well, the most famous example now is a coronavirus. Coronavirus does fine in bats. They nice symbiotic relationship. The virus gets along with the bat gets along with the virus, no problem. The problem is when they spread from a bat to people. And we think in the coronavirus case, the one that's a problem now, I think what happened is they did some manipulation, some added function. They added a gene to the virus, and they could splice that in. That's what we did when I was at the medical school. You can splice genes in, and you can remove genes. There's a very precise way of doing that. And they think they put some genes in there causing a problem. And therefore, that problem is what we see today. That virus, I understand, I've never been there, but the lab in Wuhan wasn't supposed to be level 5, I understand it wasn't. People who have been there say that it was not clean, it was not taken care of properly. And before you go into that level, you basically take a bath in bleach. You wear a spacesuit and take a bath in bleach to get in. And so therefore, it prevents any problems, and the same thing to get out. And I understand this protocol wasn't followed as it should be, and that's how the virus escaped to Wuhan first and then escaped spread throughout the world. And so we have a problem because, in this case, evidently, we caused it. The researchers caused it, probably for good reason. They were trying to deal with what happens if this virus did appear in the natural world. Could we treat it? So it's kind of like when I did research on cancer at the medical school. We had rats that didn't have cancer. So how do you research on rats that have cancer? Well, you have to give them cancer. And so we had a tobacco carcinogen they used, NK, I believe was one of the main ones we used. You have a tobacco carcinogen that we use to cause skin cancer on the rats. So then once you cause skin cancer, then you could do research on treating it and trying to understand what changes were involved in causing the skin cancer. And therefore, as a result, you can do the research. So I think their intentions were good, but they had some people who were not careful and ended up, of course, contaminating the world with this virus, which now they say the virus will be with us forever because once it's in the population, and many people, in fact, they estimate 15, 20% had the virus, the coronavirus, and didn't know it. So they're infected and they can give it to other people and they didn't know it. So it could well be that the virus is part of our the environment of the people in the world, and it could be we'll never get rid of it. So it's part of it. So my guess is the same thing is true with viruses. Once they got out of their host, the proper host, and became part of our environment, became part of our genome, and then they will spread throughout history and they will cause problems. And so I think that's another way that they got out and caused the problem. Well, AIDS, of course, is a good example. AIDS is a virus which is no problem, I understand, in certain primates like monkeys. So they have it, doesn't cause a problem, doesn't cause us a problem, doesn't cause them a problem. It caused a problem when it got out of the monkey and got into humans. And that, I understand, was because of eating a monkey or inappropriately behaving with the monkey. And as a result, it passed from the monkey to humans, and that's what caused the problem. And now, of course, through medication, they're able to deal with AIDS. And that is one problem because now they have it and they continue behaving inappropriately. And as a result, then they end up spreading that virus to other people. I think you could probably eliminate vast majority of viruses that cause problems as not being a problem and before the fall. And so therefore, they're the result of what man has done or mistakes they've made or whatever. So therefore, viruses would not be a problem in a perfect world. And we assume in the Revelation 21 talks about the new heavens and new earth. We assume in that new heavens and new earth, viruses will again be where they belong and they will not cause the problem, but they will be helpful. And so, by the way, when you bring that up, that's one of the major reasons that people become atheists. That's the reason Darwin became an atheist. He said, why would God allow disease? Why would these awful diseases caused by viruses, of course, Darwin didn't know about that, but why would these awful diseases, why would they occur? If there's a God, he would not allow these to occur. Well, we have free will and we live in a fallen world, and therefore he has allowed these to occur. We're not robots. He does not control our behavior as we were a robot. And so we do things that are inappropriate, and therefore we cause the problem. And so you can't blame God what we did.
So it really sounds like when you're taking a look at the history of the virome, it's very expansive. So viruses, they've undergone quite a lot of change. And one particular virus, the coronavirus, has been on everyone's minds. So Dr. Bergman, we've been talking about viruses, and a subject that goes hand in hand with this one is vaccination. Dr. Jonathan Sarfati of Creation Ministries International has written in his paper, CMI, Vaccines and Vaccination, that it is a scientific and historical fact that vaccines have saved millions of lives. Vaccination is one of the most powerful advances that God has allowed us to discover to alleviate the effects of the curse. In a paper that you wrote, Dr. Bergman, you chronicle how Charles Darwin was actually against vaccines because he wanted people that he deemed to be savages who were weak in body and mind to die before they propagate their kind. You summarize the implications of Darwin's view by saying, this idea birthed the eugenics movement, which was carried to its extreme by the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi philosophy, which resulted in 12 million murdered in the Holocaust based on their presumed genetic inferiority. So, Dr. Bergman, Can you share more of your thoughts on Charles Darwin's anti-vax viewpoints and explain how vaccines work in keeping humans protected from viruses?
Yeah, Darwin felt if the weaker are exposed to disease and they die, then they don't pass those weaker genes on to their offspring. And therefore, he realized that vaccines save people who normally would die. Smallpox, of course, was a big concern back then, among other diseases. And therefore, he felt that that would be the way of improving the population. Of course, he recognized that that's not going to happen. We are a society that is compassionate for our fellow humans, and that's not going to happen. That we're not going to, when we have a means to save these people, we're not going to use it. As far as the vaccines are concerned today, there's a lot of talk about this, a lot of discussion about this, but the research seemed pretty clear that if you have been vaccinated, that by and large, you're less likely to get COVID. If you do, it's less likely to be serious. But if you get COVID by the natural means, you have immunity to it. In fact, from what I've read, you have better immunity when you've actually had the COVID virus. And therefore, this immunity will protect you from future events. Now, you can get the virus and then get it again, but generally the second exposure is far less traumatic, far less problematic. I've had friends that had the first exposure was horrible. The second exposure is pretty mild. And so therefore we have an immune system which deals with that. Now, this is something Darwin didn't know. And since if he would have understood this, he realized that natural immunity is the key to dealing with viruses, that once the population's immune, has natural immunity, it's not a problem. And he didn't, of course, know that. But he felt that people who got polio or got smallpox, etc., were weak. And of course, we know that that's not true. That's not the case. They're not weak. They're just susceptible. We all know, and I'm sure you know, people who are really healthy and jog 10 miles every day and just they ate really well and they're just super good health. And then they get the COVID virus and within 4 days, they're dead. And so you can't judge superiority or inferiority based on physical things that we look at, like, gee, they're really healthy and they've never been sick a day in their life and they get the COVID virus and they're gone. Now, those are rare, we have to admit, they're very rare. But on the other hand, they do occur. And therefore, you may be strong in 14 areas, but weak in one area. And so Darwin was kind of looking at overall weakness, which of course was a mistake. But from what we know, the vaccine is helpful for a vast majority of people. In fact, they say, 80, 90% effective, but that means 10, 20% can get the COVID. And therefore, it's not perfectly a cure.
So I'm actually really grateful that you took the time to address the subject of vaccination, Dr. Bergman. And since we did just cover vaccination, I think we should also cover the design of the immune system. Dr. Sarfati, in a Just the Truth interview called The Truth About the COVID-19 Vaccine, said, "When God made Adam and Eve, they were created perfect. Now, they would have had to have had a perfect immune system because our body has more bacterial cells, mostly in your large intestine, than human cells. They're good for you. And you've got about 10 times more viruses than bacterial cells, which help to regulate it. Even Adam would have had an immune system to distinguish between self and non-self. In your own paper, Dr. Bergman, called Did Immune System Antibody Diversity Evolve, you said, although very different, all known immune systems are highly effective in dealing with pathogens. No evidence exists for the evolution of the immune system, which appears to be irreducibly complex. So, Dr. Bergman, when we're looking at the evidence for whether or not the immune system has evolved, can you explain what led you to believe that the immune system was irreducibly complex?
Well, it's not only irreducibly complex, but when I taught anatomy, one of the most difficult chapters to cover was the immune system. And I have to admit, I even got confused at times and I didn't have this problem with any other organ. The heart, no problem. Nervous system, no problem. Kidneys, no problem. Bladder, no problem. Are pretty straightforward. But the immune system, and I tell students this, it is really difficult to understand because there's so many levels. There are so many parts to the immune system, and they all work together. And therefore, it's really complex. And therefore, I tell students, do the best you can. And if you got, an A on the chapter on the heart, if you got an A on the chapter on the kidney, hey, you may not do as well in this chapter, but try to learn as much as you can and try to understand at least the basics of the immune system, like like IgA and IgG and so on. So you need to understand basically how it works. And books try to do that. They try to explain it because this was a course that I taught was an introduction to the anatomy and physiology. But on the other hand, even an introduction, it gets confusing. And they admit this. So anyways, we try to do what we can. So its complexity is such, and it works obviously really well because of the many things we're exposed to which could cause a problem. How many of us die from it? It's rare. It's rare in the society to die from almost any communicable disease. In fact, most people die of cancer, heart disease, strokes, and so on. So they die of other things. Now, many people today die of infectious diseases. It's pretty rare, at least in the Western world. And so therefore, it's obviously pretty effective. And yet we're exposed to massive numbers of pathogens every day. Yeah, the key is you've got to kill the bad guys. You've got to determine the good and the bad guys. You can't kill the good guys. That's an autoimmune disorder. So you've got to be able to effectively distinguish the good and the bad guys. And you can't wait around and make sure you've got the right guys. You have two main levels. The first level is pretty non-specific. It's a generalized immune response, and you respond to a lot of stuff quickly. And to deal with it quickly, then you have the specialized immune system, the second level. And the specialized immune system is far more aggressive, but far more specific. And so you need these two basic levels in order to effectively deal with immune issues. For if you have, some pathogen that's in the body, you can't wait 3 or 4 days for the body to figure out this is a problem. You've got to respond to it first quickly. And so these two different levels are very important. And then, of course, you have other levels. You have ways of not only responding, because you've got to label the problem, this is the problem, and then you've got to be able to eliminate the problem by the white blood cells. You've got to be able to literally eat the bacteria and break it down and then spit out the bacteria parts that you eat. And so you've got to label it. The labeling is critical. With the antibodies, it's the first step, labeling the antigens, which is like your ID tag, like a driver's license. And then once it's labeled, and then the immune system has to respond by command down the road. So once it's labeled, then there's the next step, and there's the next step. And so eventually, the last step, of course, you got to clean up the mess. And so you can't let these parts float around. They could cause a problem. So you got to clean up the mess. And that means the white blood cells as well that get overloaded. They eat themselves to death. And so you got to deal with the white blood cells. So it's in many ways, I wish I would have spent more time on studying the immune system because it's really an incredibly marvelous system.
So basically, like the human immune system, it truly does sound like strong evidence for the theory of intelligent design. But before we wrap up our interview together, I wanted to cover how viruses relate to genetic entropy. Dr. Robert Carter and Dr. John Sanford, they wrote a paper called A New Look at an Old Virus, Patterns of Mutation Accumulation in the Human H1N1 Influenza Virus since 1918, which was published by the Journal of Theoretical Biology and Medical Modeling. In their paper, they documented how genetic entropy affected the H1N1 virus, writing, "While there have been numerous adaptations within the H1N1 genome, most of the genetic changes we document here appear to be non-adaptive, and much of the change appears to be degenerative. Moreover, we present strong evidence that the H1N1 genome has been systematically degenerating since 1918. This is evidenced by continuous, systemic, and rapid changes in the H1N1 genome throughout its history." So, Dr. Bergman, is genetic entropy for or against the evolutionary theory, and why?
Well, I want to understand what's going on, and that's called genetic entropy. And of course, what happens is that the estimate is each child you have has 100 more mutations than you have. And then your grandchildren would have 100 more on top of those. And therefore, the mutational load would increase until after so many generations, we end up with genetic entropy, where we end up with extinction of the individual. And this is one theory of why so many organisms have gone extinct. The mutational load gets to the point where it can't survive, and so it becomes extinct. And most viruses, as time goes on in the cyst in the body, they become weaker. And they're not stronger, they become weaker for a number of reasons. One reason is the strong virus, the more aggressive virus, kills the patient, and then the virus dies. And so they become weaker because those that are weaker, the patient survives, and then the virus can be passed on to other people. And so they do evolve in the sense of becoming weaker and not stronger. And when they talk about mutations, in many of the cases, what we're talking about is the antigen, which is the ID. It changes so that the body doesn't recognize it. And it changes through a system, a deliberate system of bringing about changes. It's like you have 14 driver's licenses, and therefore when you're caught with one and they know who you are and you get in trouble, well, you can get rid of that license and you have another one. So you can become a different person. So you can change your identity, and the next time they stop you, they look at your license and they check it out and say, well, you're not wanted anywhere for any crime, so therefore we'll let you go. But if you had your old driver's license and pulled it out, they'd say, well, you're arrested. Were arrested in the past and you're wanted for this and this and that offense, so we're going to have to bring you in. And well, now you have a new driver's license, you have a new identity, and so the viruses basically have a new antigen and a new identity, and therefore the body doesn't recognize them. The Delta 1 variant, of course, is an example of that. And most viruses, well, I should not say most, but many viruses do that. The cold virus does that. The flu virus does that. The H1N1 virus does that. The COVID virus does that. But many viruses don't. And a good example is the polio virus. Polio virus doesn't have this ability to change its antigen. It doesn't have any other driver's license. It's got one and that's it. And once the body realizes who it is and what it is, it's finished. And therefore it cannot create new identities. The polio virus can't. But the viruses that we're concerned about, the cold virus, the flu virus, and so on, they can create new identities, and therefore they can escape detection, and therefore escape, at least for a while, and therefore escape being exterminated. And therefore that is an example of design, where actually they're designed to be able to do what they do by changing their ID. But by and large, as Stanford brought out, by and large, the entropy does work and they become weaker. In fact, many viruses just deteriorate out of existence because they become so weak they can't not function as viruses anymore, and they can't reproduce, and therefore that's the end of them. And the same thing is happening with humans. Now with humans, though, we have medical intervention, which can reduce or respond in some way to that genetic load, which is being increased. And of course, some of these don't have a great effect on us. They do only when they add up. It's like a car. You have, tires getting bald, and the muffler doesn't work. And after a while, though, you get more and more problems. And after a while, the car just fails. And so the body's the same way. After a while, certain problems, no problem. You just live with it. You have sinus problems. You have certain problems. And then they add up, though, in time. And that add up, of course, is what causes death. Basically, death is a result of accumulation of mutations, which add up to a point where the organism can no longer survive. And that is, of course, a good example of genetic entropy. And we can see that in humans, and yet evolutionists can't accept that. They don't want to accept it. And even though in medicine we accept it because we know that it's occurring, and we know we have to try to deal with it what we can, but evolutionists just ignore that. And they, when I do presentations, I say evolution's true, but it's going the wrong way. We're not evolving upward, we're evolving downward. And therefore, we have more diseases today than we had a couple hundred years ago. We had some pretty lethal ones a couple hundred years ago, but we have more, as a whole, more diseases today than we did in the past, although we're more effective in dealing with them. But on the other hand, this means that many more are going to be passed on to our offspring than would be in the past. So people wonder how in biblical days they could live to be 900 years old. Well, they didn't have the mutational load. So they could easily live to be many hundreds of years old because the mutational load was very small. Where today our mutational load is very high, and therefore diseases are pretty common.
So we've actually arrived at our final question, and we've been looking at genetic entropy and how it affects people. Dr. Sanford had this very sobering point about genetic entropy in the Evolution's Achilles Heels documentary, which was that we transmit a certain fraction of our mutations to our children, and they add more mutations to it, and then they pass it on to their children, and they add more mutations still, and they add it to the next generation. So this is a problem not just for people, but for the whole human race. Logically, the human race should be devolving, not evolving. So, Dr. Bergman, it really sounds like this mortal coil will not last forever. And so, Dr. Bergman, what shall we do to inherit eternal life?
Well, understanding he's there, and of course, removing the impediments is one part of it, like evolution. And you have to understand that Jesus is there, and he's given us a promise, and basically all you have to do is accept that. And your acceptance of that then is called a born again experience. And some people are more difficult to accept, some people are more stubborn, and some accept it readily. And often they accept it according to the experiences that they have around them. Paul, of course, accepted it somewhat unwillingly, but he did accept it at the road to Damascus. But on the other hand, some of us have the environment around us and we resist accepting, but eventually people get to the point, if their heart's right and if they're sincere in asking Jesus for his forgiveness, they accept it and then they move forward into the new life. And that changes them from that point on. And there's still struggle, there's still growth and so on. And don't go from imperfect to perfect overnight. But on the other hand, you're in the right path. And that path can help move you towards more and more perfection. Not that you can be first perfect in this system, but as Jesus said, be perfect as your Heavenly Father is perfect. So we can strive towards that perfection. And that's what we need to do. And remind ourselves occasionally the need to do that and to need to grow. Not to be the way I was yesterday, but to be the way I want to be tomorrow.
Dr. Bergman, thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure to have you on again. And to our listeners, thank you very much for taking the time to learn with us on current topics in science, where scientific discoveries are examined in light of the origins issue. You can find Dr. Bergman's biographical information, links to several of his video presentations, and his books in the description. Remember to actually check out the first interview we did with Dr. Bergman on the Current Topics in Science channel, and please share and subscribe. It's available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Thanks again for listening, and remember, the truth saves.